Welcome. In today's episode of the Georgian Election Guide, we'll dive into the economic policies of the various parties and coalitions vying for power. But before we get into that, we've got some hot topics to cover. We'll discuss the apology to Ossetians given by Georgian Dream founder Bidzina Ivanishvili, the new sanctions announced by the US government, and the introduction of anti-LGBT propaganda laws, and much more. But first, let's meet the hosts. Gio, why don't you start?
Hello, my name is Georgian Elections and I study political science in Tbilisi.
Rezi. Okay.
Hello, I'm Rivaz Karanadze. I'm a Georgian political economist and a former student activist and also a union organizer.
Brian.
My name is Brian Gigantino. I'm a historian and co-founder, co-producer of the podcast, Reimagining Soviet Georgia.
And I'm Sopo Japaridze. I'm a labor union organizer, head of labor union, also part of the Reimagining Soviet podcast. I don't want to get into it too much. You know who I am, hopefully. Let's move into the topics. So let's open up the apology that Bidzina gave in Gori to Ossetians, or said that possibility of an apology after sort of going through this reconciliation process, or like finding out the truth, which she calls the Nuremberg trials. Very, very volatile word to use about the former ruling party, investigate their role in starting the 2008 war and the fact that this was, first attack on Ossetians before Russians invaded. So what do you guys think about that?
Can I go first? So for me, it is really unprecedented someone as high in a high position like Bidzina to actually think about an apology after a conflict and an ethnic clash. So for me, it was something positive from my perspective, because in the post-Soviet space, we have seen in the 90s this ethnic conflicts in Georgia between Georgians and Ossetians, Georgians and Abkhaz, between Azerbaijanis and Armenians. So for me, someone saying that we should really start thinking about reconciliation, maybe we should really think about our own actions and think about to apologize, it is something unprecedented. And for me, it was quite progressive. On the other hand, I was shocked by how some of the non-governmental organizations and liberals behaved, because these people have been getting funding to have some sort of public diplomacy, reconciliation talks with Abkhaz and Ossetians in Georgia, right? These liberals. And there's also a Ministry of Reconciliation and People's Dialogue in Georgia. It was very much Western-funded institution, and somehow these people who were talking about the reconciliation said that this was a wrong move and suddenly became ultra-nationalist from my perspective, and they said this is an apology to Russia. And instead, they absolutely, utterly ignored Ossetians and Abkhazians. And because the biggest problem for me is that most of these people talk about the occupation, but do not have real politics. If the Russian forces are withdrawn, what do we do with and to the population that actually lives there, that are ethnically Ossetians and Abkhaz? So that is the question in my hand, and I was really shocked by the people who talked about reconciliation and dialogue and about the actions that Georgia did in the 90s were problematic. Nowadays, changing their narrative 180 degrees.
I'll just say one thing about this situation, which is that on the one hand, of course, there's going to be a lot of positions and ideas and even rhetoric that both the opposition and Georgian Dream are going to be deploying in the lead up to the election, right? Every single country, when there's a pre-election cycle, are doing things to mobilize their bases and get people excited. So that obviously is playing a factor in the timing. However, I really do believe that the very difficult position that Georgia has been in is that if it wants to find a resolution both to the conflict with the Ossetian people and eventually the Abkhaz people, there has to be some kind of recognition of the Georgian faults in the situation, but also a more difficult and tricky geopolitical aspect of this dynamic is that how do you make peace with Russia if your formal position is to view the entire conflict as a extension of Russian aggression? And I think that this is also playing the dual focus of saying, well, there is actually a fault here, and that fault has to do with this previous government. And I think that in the eyes of the leadership of Georgian Dream, they view this as a strategy to begin to open the door towards more serious normalization in the medium to long term with the Russian Federation politically, as a route towards solving the territorial issue, which of course neither the EU, the US, nor NATO are going to be able to provide or guarantee for the Georgian leadership. So it seems like it's an opening of the door towards sort of like peace negotiations and normalization. And I think that that's a very important aspect of what's going on. Whether it works or not is to be seen. But I think that that's also guiding the strategy, in my view.
Well, I can say that if we're talking about peaceful reconciliation, there's really no other way other than, apologizing for your own faults. This doesn't really mean that, Bidzina was talking about how every Georgian is at fault here, or that we are the problem. And I think that Georgian people, at least most of them, understood it, even though there are, some NGOs and some organizations that are trying to make it out to be what it's not. I think mostly Georgians understand that it is not, just randomly blaming Georgian people for the war that happened. And the unfortunate case is that this conflict has been going on for 30 years already. You cannot really forget 30 years. You cannot just skip over. You cannot censor it. You cannot put a stamp on it. You kind of have to discuss it. You kind of have to, figure it out. And you cannot really figure it out when there has been so many victims on both sides, and you just are unwilling to apologize or at least come to some kind of compromise. So yeah, this is even a necessary step, not only just a good one. That's all I can say about this.
Well, do you think there are legitimate critiques of the way this was done?
Well, probably the only critique could be that it's long overdue. Where were they before? Even when we not ignoring the UNM government and talking about the GD, where were they before? It's been 12 years since they were in power. So it's kind of, I think a part of Georgian population thought that this Nuremberg trials, or however they're going to call it, would happen in 2012 when they first came in power, and they would investigate it immediately. But, well, it didn't happen, so it is happening 12 years later. I guess better late than never, but probably it's slightly also politically motivated.
Yeah, I just want to say, just quick comment on that I think it is important to consider that in the lead up to elections, that everybody is going to be saying one thing, and then whether it comes to reality in the aftermath of the elections is to be seen. So I do think it's important to always consider these things in the context of, like, mobilizing people, pre-election positioning and jockeying of kind of politics. But it's still, I think maybe what's most interesting is that the reaction to it by many, especially in the opposition and others in society, seem to be almost mobilizing against the idea of reconciliation and peace. I think that Georgian Dream had a very clear strategy here of trying to basically show that those who would oppose such an idea are those who are interrupting or undermining a potential peaceful path in Georgian politics. And I think that that was done very strategically on the side of the government.
Actually, Brian's words reminded me of Dina Radz's interview. Not interview, I mean, he was kind of like ambushed by journalists. And he kind of fought back. He asked one of the journalists whether he considers Ossetian people the friend of Georgians. And the journalist said no. So Dina Radze answered, then you're also the enemy of the state, not only just the enemy of the Ossetian people. So they're really pushing it, finally, 12 years later.
And the funny
But it's
thing is,
kind of shocking that a journalist would say that Ossetians are enemies of Georgians when, at least according to us, they're part of the Georgian state. So saying that one part of your state is the enemy, that's coming from a journalist at that. Really shocking.
that is a problem because that is the narrative that is coming also from the opposition funded television formula that is actually run by Georgian Israeli businessman and oligarch Gezerashvili. And it kind of shows the attitude more or less of the opposition parties, some of the opposition parties and some of the opposition media, how they view it. And that is why somehow when I try to engage with them, like, what do you think about these ethnic conflicts? They are always trying to pin it on Russians, and they try to avoid talking on Ossetians and Abkhazians. So there's a lot of thing to dig there.
I don't, tell me if you hear the renovations. I'm going to, can you hear it? Okay, good. So I think a good critique is that this was done sort of out of the blue. There is no kind of peace process at all in place. So though I could, argue that Georgian Dream, by making this move, is setting the stage for maybe a peace process and reconciliation and different kind of parties to be involved in this. But as it stands now, it's like nothing was happening really, or at least nothing was happening on a national level that was seen. And all of a sudden there's an apology from the Georgian side. But like, were Ossetians even in any conversation with Georgians up until that point? And so I think that this is sort of what seems really strange from a lot of people. I still consider it a good thing that this happened, because I think it opened up space for different kinds of conversations and people to be able to publicly state that they are for peace, because that has been unable to be articulated for fear of being called like a traitor, that you actually do want peace with Ossetians. At the same time, it has exposed, as many of you have already said, that this wasn't actually about Russia. There was a lot more ethnic hatred towards Ossetians, which was Russia was helping it, look presentable, right, acceptable by the West, that you said it's Russia, that we're against Russia's occupying the territories. Well, those people, the occupied territories, they have this one ethnic group that lives there, they're called Ossetians. And before, in the 90s, sort of anti-Ossetian hatred was much more palpable. Ever since this pro-Western course, it has been sort of cloaked under Russia, which I actually find probably better in some ways. So I find this like ethnic hatred and wars even worse, so like blame it on Russia being a big empire, maybe actually a better healthier way to deal with it. But once you pulled away Russia, all of a sudden it's like a lot of people show their true face, that they actually hate Ossetians. We're putting up videos of Ossetians killing Georgians to stoke ethnic hatred. It's like, and there was this great Batu Malevi had this like great like man who like was arguing with a journalist about like, we should say peace. Like there's also Ossetians also have people who were killed by Georgians. Like we all have grievances. We all have tragedies on our sides. To say that only Georgians have tragedies is like not the full picture, And he kept saying like, do you know that the it's really annoying, like journalist, clearly he sounded young, was trying to make this older man like feel like he wasn't like intelligent enough, like he didn't know world affairs, he didn't know The Hague, and he didn't know like European courts, and he kept saying like, we were proved that we didn't start the war, and you're saying we owe an apology, and the guy's like, why do you keep like misrepresenting me? I'm saying Ossetians, not Russians. Russians did us wrong, you know, but we should acknowledge that we also did wrong, you know. And so it was this really horrible interview that I can't believe they even put up. I think they thought that they won with this interview, the journalist, because he just accuses this man of just being a Kremlin agent. It was like just being brainwashed by Putin, you know? And it's crazy that you're now saying that to be pro-Kremlin means to want peace. Like that is not a winning formula if you actually hate Russia. You know, why would you secede all these like things that are actually good, right? Like peace to Putin. Like this is actually what you should be taking and then using it for your own politics. But they're so blinded and narrow-minded and also like short-term victories, you know, that they can't even see that they're ceding peace, the ultimate goal, and reunification to their enemies.
One thing. No, just one thing to add is that there's a lot of speculation about what kind of formula could exist for reconciliation between the Georgian state and the Ossetians and the Abkhaz at this point. And so while we don't have any concrete, there's no concrete plan or view, I think what we should be watching is whether or not the Georgian state is going to try and make some kind of engagement with the governments in Sukhumi and Tskhinvali, and if that is the basis of a kind of reconciliation into some sort of confederation, which I think is the rumor that's been swirling around, that will be the next step of, you know, under what terms would people be willing to have some kind of reconciliation? Because while there's nationalist kind of intransigence about what that might look like, there's also the very practical kind of political and economic realities of what I think the Georgian state probably wants from reconciliation, which is not just, you know, to have territorial integrity, but also the fact that, you know, if Tbilisi and Sukhumi can come to some kind of agreement and normalization, well then, you know, trade routes, train corridors, and other kinds of like avenues for trade and economic activity can start up again, which I think is actually the ultimate goal of having a kind of conflict-free South Caucasus with more economic integration. So the question will be, you know, can the Georgian state achieve the kind of like economic integration goals, and also make the kind of like national sentiments of reconciliation and potential reunification, normalization happen.
Yeah. So I think like to anyone, don't ever cede ground to your enemies, things that you actually want. I mean, it's just a very simple formula in general. And so it's been incredible to see how unstrategic everyone is. Okay, let's go talk about, if you want, let's start with the anti-gay laws. The anti-gay laws, anti-gay propaganda law, however it's framed. Let's discuss that. Who wants to open up?
I can.
Okay.
So Georgian government decided to adopt this. Firstly, they adopted this new platform that somehow Georgian Dream that started to be a social democrat and was very keen to be liberal. Now all they do is not to talk about economy, not to talk about social problems, and they're trying to sort of adopt a conservative platform. What they do is they try to sort of bring to the table these ideas about Georgia, traditional family values, and they have enshrined in the constitution that marriage should only be between a man and a woman. Like there was any protest that Georgian LGBT community was ever trying to, you know, ask for marriage. Basically, people were asking for protections at their jobs. That was the biggest, big one. However, this year they decided to adopt a law that would guarantee that gay propaganda would not enter schools and would also sort of try to also lessen the influence of the LGBTQ organizations for the youth and etc. In addition to this all, this law is very problematic because it generally forbids and bans transgender people to have a gender surgery. And that was one of the biggest issues, because before in the country, it was really okay. And if trans people sort of had a gender reassignment surgery, they could easily get then the change of their gender in their official documents. And but now it has become very controversial, especially on the same day a famous transgender personality, Kesaria Abramidze, was murdered by her partner. And this was also then tried to be politicized, and sort of the opposition parties, and mostly not opposition parties, because although opposition parties try to be liberal, they very much also distance themselves from, from LGBT and queer issues. The big issue was Georgian Dream, when it was adopting, when the governmental party was adopting this law, said that if the opposition will not support, if the opposition does not support this law, it means they are actually pro queer, pro LGBT propaganda. So therefore, I only see it as a tool to get more conservative votes, nothing else. Because I don't think that there is such a propaganda in our country, and the Georgian Dream Party that actually does not really offer much else to the people tries to bring this law that would generally say that, oh, you cannot talk about the LGBT rights at schools. No one did. No one actually did. But that's an issue. Yeah. Would you guys want to add something to it?
Yeah, I think I mean, what are you fighting exactly? Like, how many cases were there where, in the labor situation, the worker was like, you have to refer to me by, my different pronoun, which we don't have pronouns, they're gendered, or a different name, from say like your dead name to your current name. Like, these are very rare, if not almost non-existent cases. So a lot of these laws are targeting things that don't actually happen. And so it's just like this propaganda itself, to get, I think they've adopted a lot of conservative alt info kind of platform, and they've made it part of their platform Georgian Dream has. And so, and it's really, of course, the right wing doesn't think this is enough. The really, the conservatives, the alt info types, they don't think these laws really go far enough. They're just on books, on paper, right? While for the liberals, this is the end of the world as we know it. So really didn't really help or either side in that. But I think a lot of people who they believe, that this is not targeting gay people per se. This is how a lot of workers explain it to me when I talk about it. It's targeting gay propaganda, so it's they think that this will help, keep their children safe from pride parade, from allegedly these schools being infiltrated by all these transgendered and gay people, who are wearing skirts and stuff, which doesn't happen. But so there is a popular support for these laws because the LGBT pride parade has been so vilified for so long, and also because I think it's very it's become their mainstay of conservatives, like talking about these sort of, they keep referring to it as like orgies and like sexual acts, like this the most let's say explicit sexually way of describing gay people, and then that they want to sort of have these orgies in the city center, so like, of course, Georgian society incredibly conservative. They don't even talk about non-gay sex, like very, very, very conservative society where sex just generally isn't discussed. They're actually against sex education, you know, like a lot of these conservatives, they don't want anyone to be actually discussed in a systematic manner in schools and so on, sexual education, you know, very, very conservative in that sense. And judgmental out, you know, if some, you know, sex happens outside of marriage and whatever. So in this kind of society, you have a demand around gay sex being so-called, you know, promoted, right? They're losing it. You know, they think that this is a something that will help them. Is this like a pro-family propaganda? Sorry, pro-family, you know, laws against propaganda. And so, of course, Georgian Dream has been stoking these fears. Of course, Alt Info has been stoking these fears for years. Of course, the conservatives have been doing it. Of course, the church has been involved. I mean, I've had people come to my door, try to sign a petition that, you know, marriage should be between a man and a woman. I remember during the Constitution, that was a big thing about putting in the Constitution that was like a man and a woman are the only legitimate, you know, people that can get married. I mean, it's been going on for a while. And Georgian Dream seized on it as a continuation where they weren't doing that before. They were sort of more neutral about it, and now they've become much more the actually, you know, leading the parade, sort of, you know, no pun intended. So these laws are bad. Like, there's no excuse for them. It's again a Georgian Dream election strategy. I feel like will not bring something that's positive, you know? And if you really care about pro-family, like, I can think of a million ways that you can support families in Georgia. And these laws definitely are just, unfortunately, like a red herring covering up all these other problems that Georgia society has, just like a lot of these sort of cultural issues. And it's very frustrating to me how this becomes a defining moment for everything, for the liberals, you know, for conservatives. Like, they're the same thing to me. They're the same side of, you know, the two sides of the same coin. Like, it was really, I was listening to Girchi Iago interview Alt Info, and he calls it, oh, isn't LGBT like your signature, anti-LGBT like your signature, you know, product? And it's like, and he feels like, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. So how can I discuss like protectionism and all these other economic, supposedly better things that Alt Info or conservatives have to offer, where they mostly focus on 99% against, you know, gender ideology, against LGBT, you know, taking us, you know, Georgia out of the Istanbul Convention because apparently poor men are being locked up for you know, domestic violence just for raising their voice a little bit. I mean, direct quote here, you know? So it's like we have like out of touch men who are making this, discussing these issues, and they just don't know these topics at all. You know what I mean? Like, they just really don't know. They know it in this incredibly superficial manner, and they really are leading charges against a lot of things that are a real problem in Georgia, like gender violence, you know, like intimate partner violence. Those things should be very much protected. So I don't know. It's a very difficult time that this has become the only thing that people are being polarized around that. And of course, Russia and LGBT are the two things that people are being polarized around.
Can I chime in? So the thing is that, as you said, that there are many problems that would actually help Georgians. They're always talking, conservative talking points about demography, how Georgians are, you know, living the country. Well, if you don't want the, people to leave the country, raise the minimum wage. We have around $7 per month as a minimum wage since 1999. There are lots of professionals, nurses, doctors that are leaving the country because the economic and social situation is unbearable. Most of my friends, and I'm in my early 30s, have left the country because there are no well-paid jobs. They're not even regularly paying jobs in the country. There's no economic and social perspective of social dynamics in the country. They're living the country. They go and work in European Union countries where where they are getting low-paid jobs, but these low-paid jobs in the EU are still much higher income jobs than they are normal jobs in Georgia. So if you really want to, help the demographic growth in the country, if you really want to talk about family, what has been the biggest problem of family disintegrations in the country? Economy. And since the collapse of the USSR, the divorces are getting higher and higher, and statistically speaking, because of the economy. The economy is the first and primary problem. But unfortunately, conservatives do not know anything about it. They don't, as Sopa mentioned, these men are like, looking from colored glass on these very issues and talk about, family and demography and do what like Alt-Info does, for example, or the conservatives. But Georgian Dream had many times chance to increase the minimum wage, to improve the socioeconomic situation, but they did not, because they are still a very much neoliberal party at heart.
I just want to say very quickly, is that, as you both mentioned, obviously the anti-LGBT laws are not only a huge problem, but they are an attempt to kind of like not discuss the deeper issues of the society, and they're an attempt to mobilize this conservative and kind of excluded part of the population. But I also think it's important to consider how these laws are an extension of a much longer cultural war that's been going on in Georgia for decades. Because even in the kind of UNM period, right, when there was this attempt to build a state that said the Soviet person is not a part of the Georgian society anymore because they are the backward person holding us back, this is kind of a continuation and a reaction of a much longer cultural war that's been like embedded into the framework of Georgian politics since you could even maybe argue in the 90s when some of these more kind of nationalist conservatives were talking about similar cultural issues. And so we also, if we're going to say like, it's not just that there was some kind of, liberal society in which everybody was on the same page, but there's actually been a long-standing cultural war between, the kind of excluded, poor, conservative parts of the population and a kind of like more liberal elitism. One of the big issues I see is that when LGBT politics are not really about people's on the ground lives, but tend to be dominated and monopolized by a kind of liberal elitism and associated with like Western geopolitics, you end up having a situation where people who are excluded from like, say, marketization or like the European project, for example, Georgia's like attempted, European integration project, they end up articulating their anger and anxieties through these cultural issues themselves. So, sort of what both Ravaz and Sopa were mentioning. So I think it's really important that we talk about what an actual program of like helping LGBT people and protecting LGBT people would look like. And then one last final point is that, I think there was a narrative that came out that this LGBT law was the direct inspiration for the murder of the trans woman Kesaria. But the problem is that trans people get murdered regularly. They have a very difficult time, not only in Georgia, but in the West as well. And we know for many years that like the issue of trans violence, basically most of the time coming from their intimate partners, not just a kind of radical who heard some anti-LGBT propaganda, is a much deeper problem that needs to be examined beyond whether or not these laws are passed or not. So you can oppose these laws and try and investigate what the root cause of anti-trans violence in Georgia and the whole world is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the critique here in general has been all of the way LGBT has been promoted in Georgia has been not very much tied to real like lived experiences of people here that would work. Like if you want to be strategic about acceptance of gay people, I just don't think you would start with pride. Like of course, I'm 100% actually for pride, but like I think there's many other steps that you could have taken, like to create a hospitable sort of environment where then it would make sense. Like if you have we know we've been fighting, and we always say this, and people don't seem to understand that, but like fighting for a living wage is a pro-gay position. When a lot of gay people cannot leave their homes because they cannot make a living wage, they cannot live on their own, it becomes a huge problem, right? So if you want also, same thing with women, empowering women. If you don't have a living wage, you are stuck with your, violent partner, abusive partner. That's most women you talk to. That's why they stay with these men, because they cannot leave. They do not have economic means. So by economic empowerment, you're actually setting the stage for people to be able to have and realize their own potential and, and defend themselves against abusive situations. But then they don't want to focus on that. They want to focus only on what's on the streets, what's on TV and so on. And because at the end of the day, everyone who's involved with a lot of these NGOs in LGBT rights do believe in the free market. For them, they do believe that capitalism is a nice, healthy thing that we should have. And civil and political rights are the most important in the world, and economic rights are sort of up to you. You got to figure it out yourself, And then if you ask most people, they don't leave because they were being, picked on for being gay. They're leaving because they cannot make money, Everywhere it is very low wages. You cannot survive in this country with one wage. You just can't. You cannot have a house. You can't do anything. So that's why a lot of trans people are also in sex work, because it pays way more than having conventional jobs, even if those jobs were available, and even if you fixed all the civil and political rights, where there was no discrimination around trans people at work. Okay, but there still won't be making any money to survive, So at the end of the day, living wage is one of the ways, and free healthcare and so many other ways are the ways you fight for gay equality, for trans equality. That's how I see it. And I think a lot of other people see it. We used to be able to have this open conversations about it. Now it's completely closed. And only now every single person that used to be critical of Pride now just discusses in these terms of Pride is good, visibility is good, we need to defend these things. Do you want to say one last comment? Okay.
I guess I can elaborate more on how this problem that the Georgian Dream is talking about is absolutely non-existent, because in this group, I'm the closest one who was a high schooler and a middle schooler, so I remember everything that happened in school quite vividly. It was kind of like a shock, because in Georgian educational system, it's like the universities are extremely liberal, but schools are extremely conservative. So I had to go through this like extremely conservative to extremely liberal in such a short amount of time that I still don't even grasp how the transition happened, because the things that, for example, we talked about in universities, which are not actually that extreme. It's not like we talk about like gay sex every day there. But the things that we are kind of at least allowed to talk in the universities, I would never imagine in my like school life that I would ever be talking about with anybody, especially in a formal environment. And in fact, we were kind of like extremely sheltered as kids. Probably I've heard about like LGBT for the first time when, that famous crash between during the Pride happened, when the conservative movement kind of, like came out and beat up like a couple of gay kids during the Pride, I think in 2014. So at that time I was like 12 years old, and I don't really remember there aren't any teachers that are pushing any kind of gay propaganda, at least what I remember from 5 years ago. I don't remember any teacher actually speaking about it. I don't really remember talking about it even with my, my classmates ever. It was just a non-topic. I just don't remember anybody talking about it. And what Sopa mentioned is completely correct about sex education. We talked about sex education for one class in 12 years. And that was only because of my specific teacher was proactive. And that was proactivism, the fact that she dedicated just one class in 12 years to that topic. And even that was, like, she was like beating around the bush and trying to be conservative about it. So yeah, this topic, especially like like gay propaganda amongst the kids, just doesn't happen. I just know it because I was there like 5 years ago, so I remember how it was. We're extremely sheltered. Like those topics, I just didn't even. And I studied in the biggest public school in Georgia, and I was like a kid who spoke English, and I had access to internet, so I was the one who was quote unquote the most exposed to it, but even I didn't know a lot of stuff that I know right now. So, and all of this knowledge I accumulated like 2 and 3 years ago, not when I was in high school even. And the second thing that I wanted to say about is how kind of at some point the Georgian Dream gets hinged, like unhinged. I mean, when they talk about this stuff, especially, do you guys know this like very famous case that happened in town Kaspi, when Georgian Dream representative was talking about how they need to ban gay marriage in Kaspi? What? This is probably the funniest thing that happened because, first of all, this is a unitary state, so whatever the law is in Tbilisi is in Kaspi. So I don't know why he was talking about as if like Kaspi is some like autonomous region with gay marriage. And then at the same time, Kaspi is like an extremely impoverished city. Like a lot of its residents don't really have even basic necessities. And here comes the representative of the ruling party talking about how they need to ban gay marriage, something that is already legal in town of Kaspi, in like one single town, which doesn't happen. I don't know if there is a gay scene in Kaspi. I extremely doubt that there is any, but it's just so unserious. But at the same time, it's kind of unhinged and it just fanning the flames that yeah, it's so visible that they do this to get the votes and nothing else, because it's just there is no such thing as gay marriage in Caspian. There's no such thing as like pushing gay propaganda in schools. I know, one, from personal experience, second from basic knowledge. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and I just want to add like another layer that unfortunately LGBT rights has now become part and parcel of US sort of imperialism. And so people think so having like an anti-Western, anti-US position, they they believe it goes hand in hand with being anti-LGBT. And so it's very difficult when you have geopolitics and US imperialism mixed with gay rights, because it really does a huge disservice to gay rights, because it makes it politicizes it in a way that's like now tied to the US. So everyone who's gay or pro-gay will automatically be pro-West, and everyone who's against the US and West is automatically a homophobe and hates gays. So this has been incredibly cynical, because also the anti-gay stuff also comes from the US. Like this stuff around schools, these are the discussions in the US, because they had some instances and it's overblown as well. So it has nothing to do with Georgia. The talking points and the fears are exported from the US and imported here. Pro-gay and anti-gay are both coming from the Western world, US specifically, except that now the Democrats are in power and the liberal hegemony uses it as a tool of foreign policy, while the Christian churches and the Baptists and evangelicals and so on have all these ways that they disseminate anti-gay messages, and which has now become supposedly anti-US, which actually comes also from the US, not Russia, because it went into Russia from the US, but Russia, of course, puts their own brand on it like everyone else. Do we want to keep talking about this, or do you want to move on?
Let's move on.
Okay, the sanctions. Let's talk about the sanctions. Who would like to begin?
I can just say a few things really quickly about this. Obviously, most people are aware that the relationship between the ruling Georgian Dream Party and the United States and the leadership of the United States has been worsening over the past, we could say, couple of years, and has come to a kind of crescendo of tensions. And there's been a back and forth, essentially, of statements and actions between the United States, various representatives of the United States, the ambassador who's in Tbilisi, but as well as people in Washington and other members of Congress, people from the various officials in the United States that have come out essentially and publicly been pressuring Georgian Dream in their lead up to the elections. As probably listeners are aware, there have already been actions from the U.S. side about reconsidering the relationship between Georgia and America. The polling of, I think, something like $90 million, if I remember correctly, $95 million of support to the Georgian government. And of course, there has now been a recall from the Georgian side of the Georgian ambassador to the United States, David Zekaliani, his name I remember correctly. And the most recent has been very targeted sanctions by the United States on particular individuals. One of the men who was involved in from the Interior Ministry, who was involved in some of the policing of recent protests, as well as Maharadze from Alt-Info, was also sanctioned. And now there's discussion openly, I think it became a leaked secret, that there's discussions about directly sanctioning Bidzina Ivanishvili. And Voice of America just released a statement that they got information from a U.S. official that Bidzina was working on the behest of Russian intelligence services. So on the one hand, we have the United States relying on its very ineffectual, anybody who's been paying attention, the United States has a very ineffectual tool of sanctions. The United States for the past decade or so has been increasing the sanctions in a number of countries around the world, not just Georgia. It's a pressure tool to try to sort of like elicit compliance or undermine sort of politics that the United States finds to be inconvenient. And it seems like some of these sanctions and targeted sanctions on specific members of the Georgian Dream Party are going to continue in the lead up to the elections. So there's two parts to this that I want to say. On the one hand, it seems like sanctions are a very, not only ineffectual tool, but it breeds kind of resentment towards the United States. I think now we're living in a period where states are no longer looking at sanctions as the end-all, be-all thing to be avoided, but rather figuring out how to circumvent them and create new relationships to kind of circumvent sanctions if they're instated. And then the second thing is that this is a political intervention into the pre-election cycle in Georgia, where the United States and the EU are very openly siding with the broad opposition forces against Georgian Dream. And so they're trying to kind of show that they're unhappy with the current leadership. I think the question that we need to look at is like, will these sanctions expand? And will they deepen, for example, if Georgian Dream wins the election? And to what? And then the question that I think is not really discussed is, how are Georgian people on average actually interpreting the sanctions? Because I have a feeling that there's a segment of the population that actually is kind of, even if they don't like Georgian Dream, probably don't believe that U.S. imposing sanctions is something that they approve of on their country, regardless of who's in power. And I think that on the other side, what we're seeing is that the most of the opposition forces, both parties and non-party aligned people, are viewing the sanctions as the representation of the fact that the West is incredibly unhappy and that Georgian Dream is undermining Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations.
Looking at the interview that Maharadze did, Yago was like, oh, this is like a bonus for your elections, because now it's like you made your party cooler because it's sanctioned by the US. So they look at it as a positive to get more votes out there for Alt-Info. Now they've become these real enemies, you know? So they're looking at it in a very positive way. And so I don't know how, if that's going to have an effect on anyone who's going to vote for them anyway, you know? They just hardened their base. And most of their base are disaffected Georgian Dream voters, you know? So any comments on this? Yeah, I think it's just quite remarkable that just the levels of intervention just keeps escalating.
The only thing I'll say, the only thing I really want to say, and I'll keep it very short, is that I think that what is lacking in the discussion about the tension between Georgian Dream and the United States is, and I think listeners need to take this very seriously, is why would a state like Georgia, and especially the ruling party Georgian Dream, who had been actually deepening relations with the United States most of its tenure and had been deepening ties with the European Union, all of a sudden was willing to have this open political conflict with the United States? And I think that that's actually maybe a discussion for another time, but it's something to consider, that I don't believe that that Georgian Dream is simply becoming like a anti-US or even anti-Western state, but there seems to be a very big disagreement between the United States and Georgian Dream on the strategy that's being deployed on normalization with Russia, and I'd say even more importantly, and maybe we can talk about this in the next episode, deepening geoeconomic ties with China. Because as we know, the United States is basically mobilizing into a kind of new Cold War with China and is viewing the situation in Georgia as sort of Chinese kind of taking over what they believe is their territory in terms of like political and geoeconomic territory of Georgia. And so I think that the government is very upset about this. And the reason that we can see this is like Jim O'Brien, for example, from the head of one of the heads of Eurasian affairs of the United States, is constantly mentioning the fact that one of their anger with Georgian Dream has been economic ties with Russia deepening since the war in Ukraine, and of course the Georgian government giving the tender for the Anaklia port to a Chinese Singaporean consortium that's sanctioned by the United States.
Okay, we should move on because we have parties and their economic platforms to cover. Who would like to begin?
Let's begin with Georgian Dream, and we can just start with like ruling
Rather not.
party. Maybe
Rather go last. No, I'd rather go last if you would like to begin.
Okay. Guy O'Brien, would you like to start?
Do you want to start with the biggest opposition, UNM, or?
Well, I'd rather keep the UNM with the GD.
Yeah, Gil, you go first.
Okay, then. I'll pioneer this discussion. Then, okay, I guess we're starting from kind of less important parties. So, the coalition Strong Georgia. Let's start with this one. So, to refresh our memories, Coalition Strong Georgia consists of 3 minor parties, which is Lela for Georgia, For People Party, and the Citizens Party. And there's also one movement, it's called Freedom Square Movement. The most prominent figure of the whole coalition is Khazaradze, a Georgian businessman who established and used to manage Georgia's one of the largest banks, TBC Bank. But he was also involved in other like major industries in Georgia. In the first episode, we kind of discussed how contradictory some of the statements are issued by Khazaradze and other leaders of coalition, and I think we're building onto that because the more I read about their party program, the more I realized how contradictory it is. There's no other word for that. The coalition's main program is called the Ilias Way, referencing the beloved 19th century Georgian writer Ilya Chauchawadze. But it also has the second name, which is the Marshall Program, the famous post-World War II plan to reconstruct Europe, but now it's to quote-unquote reconstruct Georgia as well. The goal of these programs is to create a strong, patriotic, pro-Western, and anti-Russian Georgia. So the coalition names Euro integration as its #1 priority. So in this Marshall Plan, as they call it, or in the Ilia's Way plan, the first priority is the Euro integration. So I will not really delve into that any deeper. So they start talking about economics after that. They promise a lot of things. I have to say that they promise a lot. For example, they promise 200,000 new jobs. They promise 1,000 lari pension. They promise increased incomes for the military personnel, guaranteed internships, paid internships for the graduates, so I might vote for them. The green development, grants worth of 5 billion lari for small and medium-sized businesses, implementing minimum wage by calculating with the new model. Well, I don't really know why they need to calculate it with a new model because Fair Economy Institute already calculated it, but they don't really name what kind of minimum wage they'll give. They just, said that there will be a minimum wage. So we're going with that. They also promised to rejuvenate Georgian agriculture and start exporting Georgian agricultural products worth of 1 billion lari, which is a serious increase from quite little deficit that we have right now. And a decrease of Georgia's dependency on imports. So I read the whole program and none of these points are ever elaborated much. The whole program pretty much repeats. So we will achieve this because we will achieve this. Just that. There's no, there are almost no concrete examples. Well, for example, they promised to create 200,000 new jobs. And they only give us one example of it, which is Anaklia Port and tourist destination, which even by their own estimates will give only 16,000 jobs. Most of them will be temporary and half of them will be, seasonal because Anaklia is a tourist destination and nobody will go there during autumn. It's only for summer. So how will they establish rest of the, 200,000 jobs? It's unclear from this program. Then also most of their promises directly contradict their other points. For example, high pensions and high salaries for military personnel doesn't go in line with the coalition's promise of a fiscal conservatism. This is one of their stances in their manifesto, like what the party actually stands for. And the party stands for what they say, it's fiscal conservatism. They said that the government budget will be low and there will not be much debt, but at the same time, they want to go with this huge expenses like 6 billion lari worth of investments into agriculture and financial sector. Then there's the topic of green development and implementing a legal minimum wage, which directly goes against the coalition's another point of the manifesto, which is to further deregulate the economy and create a business-friendly environment. In fact, in a very same clause where they talk about that they will implement a minimum wage, they also say that the minimum wage should be fair to the businesses. So I don't know what business-friendly minimum wage will be. Probably like 40 lari, maybe. So like doubling it. I don't know, but yeah. So like lots of incoherences. Then there's the big part of this Marshall Plan. Is that the coalition will supervise lots of mega projects that GD supposedly abandoned, which I don't know how they will do because again, the manifesto is the thing that goes against their Marshall program and the Ilia Way program because the manifesto says that they are also for the small government. So they're for small government and the fiscal conservatism, but at the same time, they're for these like great mega projects that apparently GD blocked because they're pro-Russian and all that. They want to create like ports and infrastructure and jobs and investments, but they want to do it with the small government, with a small bureaucracy. And some of the points are actually quite insulting, especially to me, because they assigned one industry to each region. It's like a Hunger Games style. So each region has an industry. Actually, my region didn't get any kind of industry, so I feel neglected. And one of those regions, Samskhe, which is a big region, their prime industry is supposed to be historical tourism. So a region with a population of 150,000 people should rely on historical tourism, which is a very niche thing. Now, then there's a region of Kakheti, which supposedly will become, capital city of wine industry. This basically, I mean, I can go on and on and on talking about this Marshall Program and how just incoherent and fantastical it is and basically populist, but I can just, stop with these examples because obviously the party's headed by a businessman. The coalition is headed by a businessman and an oligarch, and obviously he'll align the government policy with his own interests. That's why the party representatives in like different interviews, they're talking about how they will decrease the taxes on businesses and every kind of taxes. So basically the question is, how will they create a socially responsible business model in Georgia if they will decrease every kind of taxes? They'll deregulate the economy, and by that, how will they even promote it, the green development that they're talking about? Because private enterprises are not really known for green development, and yeah, they're going to continue basically the same policy as, for example, the UNM did in the previous government. But at the same time, they'll create a social responsibility. By what exactly, I'm not sure. I read the entire document, but I'm left confused by their promises. It's basically that. That's why, actually, the funny thing about it is that the other opposition parties made fun of Lelo's party, the whole coalition, the strong coalition, and their program, because it's so fantastical. It's so out of this world, and everybody kind of understands that this is just pure populism and it's not based on any kind of research. So yeah, if you guys have any kind of comments on that.
Yeah, did you discuss their entire 9 points against Russians?
Oh yeah, I can say it quite shortly that the only thing that had literal concrete examples was about Russia. They had 9-point so-called Georgia State Defense Plan, which is literally the only plan in their party program that has actual steps that, you understand that they will do this and this and this. Okay, at least even if I don't agree, I agree, don't agree, I don't know, like it, hate it, at least I understand what they're going to do. And those steps are, they want to reintroduce visas. So how are they going to develop tourism when most tourists are Russians and they want to reintroduce visas? They want to sanction Russia just like the European states do. So again, how are they going to export our wine, for example, when Russia is one of the main importers of Georgian wine? So basically everything that they say that they'll do against Russia is what they say that they will do good for Georgia, but we don't really have any other major trade partners. So yeah, I guess that's the only plan that they have, well thought out, but it goes against everything that they say in every other party program that they post.
And maybe this is a good opportunity then to just, I think Sopo and I were going to talk about the kind of conservative forces. So if anybody doesn't have a comment, then maybe we can just move on to the kind of conservative forces. Interesting what Gio is saying, because I looked up and did some research on the economic policies of the conservative movement. And obviously, I just want to say that in the Georgian political space, there is a kind of right-wing conservative nationalism, and they have slightly different ideas and positions. And maybe Sobo can follow up with this, but I just kind of want to give a general kind of picture, is that the ideas do run the gambit of different positions, but one of them is that at least the conservative movement has been arguing for more protectionism and trying to argue that there needs to be some kind of protectionism for Georgian industry, but it's not really clear how that's going to happen. They kind of rely on this. In at least I saw some people discussing the threat of Turkish capital and trying to kind of mobilize a certain kind of anti-Turkish sentiment in their political view of what a Georgian economy should look like. There are some people on the kind of conservative wing who argue for deepening economic ties with Russia. I say the most extreme kind of iteration would be some arguing for even Georgia considering joining a Eurasian Economic Union and having some serious, more deeper economic integration with Russia, and maybe a more sort of like tempered approach is just saying that there need there's problems with the economic relations with the EU, and there's problems with the economic ties with Turkey, and that we need to that Georgia needs to focus more on these economic ties with Russia. And I think that is playing into the segments of the population that have more economic dependencies on Russia. And so, unfortunately, though, the critique of the EU relations, for example, the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement that came into effect in 2016, 2014, 15, and 16, there's not really like a deep analysis of how that free trade agreement, for example, has been undermining Georgian industry and has, as some researchers called, put Georgia in a neoliberal lock-in, like basically maintaining and reproducing the neoliberal economic paradigm in Georgia. But the conservatives tend to rely on more like nationalistic and even at times chauvinistic rhetoric to justify their economic programs. Sopo, I don't know if you had something to add about the kind of more conservative forces.
Yeah, I think I would just say, listening to Alt-Info interview, that it's really just about while the pro-West forces, which is most of the opposition, are trying to export to the EU and have this dream of only trade with the West, which allegedly brings higher standards for Georgia as well. The conservative forces are arguing for trade within the post-Soviet space because there's already a brand name there. There are no Georgian products, and they love Georgian products, and that would actually give us a much bigger market than just domestic, because this dream of 30 years of trading with the West has not been actualized. And so protection, like you said, protect certain industries, not all industries, some industries, it seems like similar lines as EU does, as US does, which is they subsidize farmers and protect them, protect the agricultural industry. But I would say these are very low on the hierarchy of what they seem to be, mostly what people know them for. So while the Western types are not for usually protectionist measures as well, they uncritically believe that if they just have access to EU, that somehow everyone would just buy Georgian products, and there will be no ways that Georgian products are marginalized or tariffs on whatever, then they'll be all accepted, because they don't even really realize that a lot of times EU uses these quality standards to keep a lot of agricultural products, they keep them out based on some supposedly quality standards. And sorry, how is Georgian products supposed to compete with insane subsidies from the EU that they give to so many other much more developed industries and agriculture? So I'm not, especially with wine, there's like so much good wine in EU. Most of our products. So it's kind of monocrop kind of approach, and also just again, belief that if it's the EU will never do us wrong, but somehow always be like fair trade with them, and everyone else, it's not a fair trade, that our products that they accept bad products from Georgia, like Russians are used to bad products from Georgia that are not being sold to the EU. Like EU demands higher standards, so this will force Georgian businesses to have higher standards, by trying to sell to the EU market. But of course, this kind of doesn't really work in real life. Sorry, go ahead.
One last final comment, and then let's move on, is that I think there is a very clear material problem that we've already kind of outlined with this economic idea that Georgia could be a state that has only or exclusively or primarily economic ties with the West. But one thing that's important is that one of the resentments that has developed in relation to the EU is that the EU is actually not able to provide an economic model of development for Georgia. And one of the ways that has manifested, from what I've been able to tell from some research, is that there's a lot of businesses and say in Georgia that if they were to be integrated into a common market with the European Union, would have to do so many kinds of transformations in their production processes, or material transformation of like how things are produced, that would be very, very economically difficult to do. And the EU is not actually in a position to actually get all of Georgian business, for example, to be on the terms that they would require them to be. And so this is not only a problem in Georgia, this is a problem also in Moldova and Ukraine, but they're very different situations because they have much larger domestic industry. So Georgia has like fewer pillars of industry and fewer products for export, for example, but even so, it's very difficult. And so I think it's actually the kind of discussions that we need to be having, which is like, can the EU actually provide Georgia a sustainable development model? And it's not actually clear based on the evidence that we have from this, for example, the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, or some of the issues in Georgian industry, that's actually the case. And the thing is that plenty of people have actually pointed this out. It's just a matter of turning that information and knowledge into some kind of political alternative. What would a Georgian sort of like industrial policy in the present day look like? What would a Georgian kind of like sustainable economic form of development look like? Maybe Rezi, Ravaz, do you want to talk about UNM now?
Gladly. So United National Movement is basically a party that is built around, at least nowadays, around a figure called Mikhail Saakashvili, who used to be our president between 2003 and 2012. 13 actually, the party was in power till 2012. Anyways, United National Movement basically is an architect of the Georgian neoliberalism, massive privatization in the country from George W. Bush era, and also bringing to the country a very strong neoconservative foreign policy along with the neoliberal economics. However, you cannot really used to tell that the UNM was a neoliberal political party, considering that during the election period, UNM generally talked about how they would increase pensions, increase wages, how they would create antitrust institutions, how would they build factories through state investment, etc., etc. However, these elections of 2024 are a little bit different. So they are in a coalition with former UNM spokesperson and former UNM member, Mr. Vashadze, who's sort of a lone wolf at this point, and he created this platform called Armashenabeli that is now sort of again with the UNM, and it's quite interesting. What they offer is basically free trade with the United States, what they want, and they say that free trade with the United States will bring stability, prosperity, and political independence from Russian imperialism in the country. At the same time, to deepen and strengthen your relations with the European Union, and through the European Union and United States, as foreign direct investments, FDIs will start flowing, and Georgian economy will start to boom and bloom. And at the same time, it will create welfare for the Georgian population. However, they do not really give specifics how to actually entice and bring these investments to the country. That's really interesting. At the same time, they're talking about how the government is ripping off the Georgian population and how they need to decrease their taxation on businesses and small businesses, especially. So they are targeting this base, but at the same time, they're not really saying how they will implement this fiscal policy. And they talk about, at the same time, as Georgi mentioned, they're quite populistic, and they're saying that Georgian students should have housing. So basically, they stole from some leftists that were very unsuccessful in articulating these policies about student housing and free meals for the students and the pupils at school. And UNM now is talking about how they should provide, universities should provide free housing for the for schools. Basically, they're not talking about anything like industrialization, social responsibility. All they talk about is Western investments. Even in their interviews or even on their political program, there's nothing much. Lelo has actually more detailed program than the UNM has. UNM is all about the West, and West will bring the best in economy. At the same time, they're also targeting, for example, Georgian migrants who live abroad. They're saying that UNM, once it is in power, they will create a President Saakashvili Foundation that will help finance migrants to come back to Georgia, help them integrate and help them start businesses in the country. So this is a quite populistic program, I think, and they move. Actually, they do not really give detailed description or do not even give any general description how they will be able to pull this off. But this is what the UNM offers. So to sum up, UNM offers now to have a free trade agreement with the United States, deepening ties with the EU. So these would bring more foreign direct investments that would help Georgia increase the economy and bring more social and economic prosperity to the Georgian people, decrease taxation for small and medium-sized businesses, finance students and finance basically housing for the students, increase pensions. I don't know how they're going to do it at the same time. They're talking about, like, fiscal conservatives, bring in free meals for students at schools and at the universities. And yeah, that's basically it. With the end, of course, creating President Saakashvili Foundation for the migrants, where the migrants can be, for the migrants to get the funding for the reintegration and for them to start small businesses. This is all that they offer about economy. There's nothing else, actually. All they talk about is how the government is pro-Russian and how we should avoid being pro-Russian. And this is the only way is to be more pro-EU. And they do not really give any specifics or any policy descriptions. At the same time, they do not even have a website, although it is the second largest party and second largest coalition in the country and the biggest opposition platform. Unfortunately, there's not much information. So what you have to do is you have to squeeze this information from their sponsored ads and Facebook and other social media platforms, and just to listen to the interviews, because I have not really seen anything that is printed out. And yeah, that's it.
So because we've gone on for so long, we're going to do the rest of the parties next episode. So next time will be Ahali, Gacharia, Georgian Dream, and Kivchi, the original, the not more freedom. So less freedom. Okay, so we'll just wrap it up now. And so next episode, stay tuned. We will discuss other hot topics that we weren't able to get to today because it takes so long for us to discuss each one. There's just so much to unpack. I always feel like we don't even do it justice often because we're rushing through it. But I mean, I could talk an hour on almost every single topic, so it's probably a problem. Okay, so stay tuned for next week. We dropped 1 week, unfortunately, but we're back and we will continue to give you weekly episodes until the elections, like we promised. And let us know if there are things that you want to know that we haven't talked about or you want to know more about. Thank you.